Born and raised Nebraska. My dad's retired state patrol, so we moved a little bit. So yeah, so I've lived in Lincoln and Beatrice when I was a kid. Graduated from Southeast in '82, and then went to the university and majored in journalism and English, and then jumped right into the newspaper business. So was the sports editor in Grand Island for 8 years, and then came back to Lincoln to my hometown newspaper. And always wanted to work in the sports department there, so I did that for another 2 or 3 years, and then we launched a magazine called Ground Zero, an entertainment magazine on Fridays, and had an opportunity to join that staff, and did so, and that's how I became a dining critic. It just was happenstance. It was supposed to be shared among the staff, but every week my editor would go, "Where are you eating this week?" Yes, so I had to come up with another restaurant, so I started eating. And so that led to 20-some years of writing restaurant reviews. And then Arcadia Publishing reached out to me, and they were looking for somebody to write a book about, they specialize in these memory books. And so they had asked if they knew anybody who would, could write it. And I said, well, that probably might be me. So yeah, I said, but I'm extremely busy, and so I said, no, thank you, but I'll give you a couple of names, and I gave them a couple of names. But then they came back to me and they said they really wanted me to write it, and so I did some hemming and hawing, and then my wife and then the local historian Jim McKee talked me into it. So yeah, so that's how the book came about. Well, that's just it. And I give a lot of these talks, and I tell folks that everybody's a critic. So, and I just happen to put my thoughts in the newspaper, So whether you're watching a television show or a movie or going out to eat, you have an opinion about something. So to start off with, yeah, so we're all critics. I didn't have any culinary background, really, and what I learned on the job. I did work in restaurants, so I was a waiter, so I had served, so I knew that part of the industry, and was in and out of kitchens, of course. I never was at a grill, though, that kind of thing. So yeah, so I learned and just read, and over the years, when we first started doing the dining reviews for Ground Zero, they were more feature stories about the restaurants. And then about 10 years in, I changed course with it because readers were wanting more criticism. They wanted that kind of thing. So we revamped it. I met with a couple of local chefs and came up with some ideas of how to do it. And so we started doing a grading system based on food quality, service, atmosphere, and specialty diets. And so we give them I give them a letter grade on that, and that's been pretty well received. So we used to, like I said, back in the old days, there were featured stories. I used to have a box, and I would do stars, that kind of thing. And then people were like, "Okay, I got 3 stars, but I want to know why I got 3 stars." That's the kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. Yes, I was always the newspaper writer, and we've always talked about if you put all of our stories, all the stuff that we've written over the years together, we've probably penned hundreds of books. But growing up, I always wanted to write a book, and I didn't know if whether it'd be a nonfiction or fiction, kind of thing. And I've dabbled in a little bit of other writing, but no, this opportunity presented itself, and it was something I was knowledgeable in, so that helped. So the fun part was doing the research and doing the history part of it, and that's what excited me about this project. So when I got into the business, I grew up reading the sports writers who, some of them I ended up getting to work with, and that included Ken and Riley James Hambleton, who recently retired from the newspaper, and Chuck Sinclair, who was at the Journal for a long time, Randy York, who now works for the university. Some of those, Mike Babcock, of course, loved Mike's columns that he wrote. and then Mike still does some writing as well and has written some books as too. So that got me interested in. I always wanted to be the starting pitcher for the New York Mets. And I was a fair baseball player, but not a great baseball player. So yeah. So if I couldn't participate, then I had to figure out another avenue. So it was, writing. So that's how it came about. And then you get to college and stuff. I was the editor of the Daily Nebraskan my last year, so that was a great learning experience. And then jumped into the sports career, and then which led to the feature writing. So it was my hometown newspaper that really inspired me, I guess.
When did you figure out that you were a writer?
I think it was in high school. I was the sports editor of the Clarion, which is the Southeast newspaper. So yeah, so it was early on. And I look back now. I mean, I could have done 100 of other things, but I was always I always liked the newspaper business. So yeah. It's funny because you say this to a newspaper person because we write every day, and so when you're not writing, it's kind of a relief. so it's a different aspect. I do know some other newspaper folks who will write in their free time, but I didn't do it. That's why the book was challenging, because I write all day, and then the last thing I wanted to do was go home and write some more. But I did. I sequestered myself in our home office and put it together. So you just. I think when you write, you enjoy doing it. Yeah. So, but not 24 hours a day. So. We've done some memory books at the Journal-Star, and we've actually kicked around one, something that would tie in with the dining scene, but we hadn't really, focused on anything. And so when the publishing company came to me, I actually went to the newspaper and said, would you like to do it? And they said, no, we've had our fill on memory books right now, so if you want to go ahead and pursue this on your own, that'd be great. And then when I started looking into the publishing company, and they do a great job. In fact, they were just recently featured in the Washington Post, because they do these memory books, and they're quite popular. I mean, they focus on areas like this, where you do Lincoln, Nebraska, and write about Lincoln, and so people from Lincoln want to read about their history and that kind of thing. So the publishing company's done memory books, restaurant book for Omaha and like Cincinnati, places like Denver, and it's not necessarily restaurants, but it's department stores, and this publishing company also does like landmarks in Nebraska. An author has done some of that stuff. So I found that interesting, because you're writing a history book, and I'm a history nut, and I think other people are too. And when I started writing, and for me, what was the interesting part was it was not just the nuts and bolts, like it opened then and it closed then. And what I wanted was kind of the people aspect of it, to find the story. So that's why I did 20-some interviews with folks. Yeah, like I said, it was about a time management thing. So you're busy. You write all day, and then you come home at night and do a little writing, or researching, or scheduling interviews around work, that kind of thing. And then weekends, doing that. But what helped me, the big thing was working at the Journal-Star. I've made all these connections in the restaurant industry. So some of these people, like the Massinio family, who own Valentino's, the family also was a part of Tony and Luigi's. So I sat down with Mike Alesio, whose dad was Tony. And he's one of the owners at Valentino's, and then his cousin Tony Massinio, and who was a manager and worked at Tony and Luigi's for a long time, sat down with the two of them. So and I'd known them before, so it made it a little easier. I wasn't a stranger to them, to do that. Nader Sepapor, whose father ran the Rotisserie downtown when it opened, Bob Sepapor, yeah. So Nader owns a bunch of restaurants still here in town. So I just, I sat down with him and we talked about his dad, So it was, I'd already known Nader, so so it just made it easy. I mean, this book could have been twice as long than it is. I started, interesting, I started with city directories. Yeah, I went back and started in 1900 and then started going forward. And what I found was in the early 1900s, there weren't a lot of restaurants really. People ate at like boarding houses, at people's residences. You would stay at somebody's house and then the owner would cook you a meal. So yeah, so you had a lot of those kinds of things. And then the restaurants really started coming into being probably late 20s and early 30s. So then I found a couple that had some longevity to it. So that's what I was looking for, was longevity, because then I started going through the city directories. I started with, okay, if they've been around for longer than 5 years, they made the first cut, and if they were around for eventually up to, if they were around for 25 to 30 years, then they were definitely in, but then once they were in, then I had to find enough information to write about it. And, that was a little easier said than done. So the Journal Stars, both the Journal and the Star, before they merged, papers are available online through newspapers.com. So I paid a subscription fee to join that, and so I could go back and I could all the restaurants I'd found through the city directories and just type in their name, and then it would jump to any stories or ads or anything referenced to that. So then I'd look, and if I was able to find information about the restaurant, then they had a better chance of making it too. And then of course a lot of them were obvious. That Tony and Luigi's of course had to be in it. The Legion Club had to be in it. What other ones would have to? Tasties, In and Out, because it had been around for 50 some years. The Steakhouse, it was around for 50 some years. So those were the obvious ones that had to be in. Probably the most famous restaurant, which is in the book, is Tony and Luigi's. And when you say Tony and Luigi's, around the state, even if you lived in Scottsbluff, you probably, if you were older, you ate there at some point when you came to Lincoln, or somebody who ate there, that kind of thing. It had that reach. So the fun part was finding the historical aspects to that, and then interviewing the people behind it. And so there were some restaurants that really put Lincoln on the map, and then there's some of those hidden gems that that people kind of forgotten about. There was a fish place on O Street called the Greenwich Cafe. It was around for years. But I mean, if you were to say Greenwich Cafe to somebody in Grand Island, they probably wouldn't know it. But people who grew up in Lincoln would know it, because it was there, and it was popular with the university professors because it was near campus. It was right downtown. So.
What about the photos? How'd you?
Oh, the photos. That was fun too. Some of them I got from the people I interviewed, and so that was very helpful. Like Cool's restaurants, for instance, the family had some great photos that helped tell the story. Journal Star, actually, a number of them came from the Journal Star library, so they were helpful there. And then Jim McKee, I mentioned him at the top, historian Jim McKee, and Jim has an extensive file of photos, and he has a restaurant category, so he gave me 20 to 25 photos to use for the book. So. I've always I've always described myself as kind of a folksy writer, where it's more of a telling a story, and so that was important to me when I wrote the books. Was it kind of had to have a story to it. For instance, we mentioned the Rotisserie, and they had a longtime waiter there, Herb Thomas, who was sadly has passed away, but everybody knew Herb, and so I knew I had to have Herb in the book, so that that helped get me into that story, because if people remember Herb, and Ground Zero, the entertainment magazine at the Journal Star, once proclaimed Herb the best waiter in Lincoln. So so you get that that face and that name that people recognize, and get it in there, that kind of thing. When I did Tony and Luigi's, I set a tape recorder between Mike and Tony, and just let it go. And when I went back, I was trying, okay, how am I going to write this chapter, you know? And what struck me was when you put a tape recorder between two Italians or two Sicilians and let them talk about food, oh my goodness, you know, you don't have to say anything, you know, they were finishing each other's sentences, and they would go back and they would like, oh, do you remember what happened in 1960 something? And they were like, oh yeah, and then, yeah, so so I basically wrote it, let them talk in the book, yeah, so. When I wrote this, I wanted to have a broad spectrum, so I wanted some restaurants that were from, you know, from the 1930s and 40s. So you'll see like the Acme Chili Grill, which was in there, and so people, you know, young people today have no clue what the Acme Chili Grill, because it closed in the 60s. It was open in the 30s and closed in the 60s. But some of the old timers, of course, will remember that, and will remember the chili. From that. The Yum Yum Hut was a place where specialized in loose meat sandwiches like Tasties did, and it you know, it ran from the 30s to the 60s. And so you want, you know, that kind of thing. But then you wanted something more current, so people who, you know, who are in their 20s, that they can connect to it too. So, and they were around for a number of years. So Crane River, for instance, which was the second brew pub to open, you know, a lot of people still have memory of that from who are, you know, around today. And then Maggies Restaurant. Maggies was open for 18 years. She was by far probably the most successful vegetarian restaurant that we had, and she just closed you know, a year or so ago, and so that's still fresh in people's memories. So you have that wide range from the Acme Chili Grill all the way to Maggie's on this end. So. It's been overwhelming, actually, because, you know, you write a book and then you're like, oh, will anybody buy it, you know? And shortly after that, one of the distributors here, 4-Star Drug over there on 56 Old Cheney, called, said that they had put in another order and were told that they had to wait because they were doing a second printing. So that made me feel good. So yeah, so it's been very good, and I've had a lot of people come up to me when I do speaking engagements, and they want to tell me their stories about the restaurants. You know, they want to tell me about the time they went to Tony and Luigi's, and, you know, they got engaged there, or they had their first date there. You know, and those are fun stories. I like that. Yeah. So, and then people will, yeah, you know, for Crane River, I brought up, and I talked about there was a quilt there, you know, that was made, and people remember that quilt. Well, the woman who did that quilt came up to one of my book signings and introduced herself to me, and she said she was very glad to see that the quilt was part of the Crane River story. So yeah, that made me feel good. When I did the story on Kay's Restaurant, Kay's was over there in Piedmont and was there for years, and it was where Terms of Endearment was filmed, so that was kind of the lead into that. But Kay was living in Florida at the time. She'd retired to Florida, so I talked to her via phone. Well, the book came out, I was at a signing, and there she was standing in front of me, and I didn't even realize she was back, but she had moved back to Lincoln, and she really wanted to say hello. So yeah, that made me feel good. The key thing is if you wanted to do a memory book, you know, or historical book, be able to have access to the information. So for me, I had access to the Journal Star library, so I was able to, you know, do a lot of research there. And then I mentioned newspapers.com, which was able to get me to stuff that weren't on file at the Journal Star from like the 30s, that kind of thing. So you need that, and then you also you need to develop a rapport with your subjects too. So I had mentioned that I already had an in with the restaurant industry, so that was very helpful. So, but now if we're trying to write a book about, you know, historical attorneys in Lincoln or something like that, you know, that might be a little more difficult. So we'd have to do a lot more research on that end. So yeah. So the key thing is having access to the research.
Do you get more feedback on the restaurants you included or the ones you left out?
Probably the ones I get left out. Yes, because everybody wanted to be in. And a couple of the talks I've given, I've had folks who have owned some of the restaurants come up and go, you know, if you're going to write another book, you know, here's my information. Yeah. So that's sweet. I love that. So yeah.
welcome to Bennett Martin Public Library. I'm Diane Wilson, and I'm the curator of the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors, which is located downstairs on the 3rd floor. And I wanted to say, if anybody has time after today's talk, you're welcome to come down to the Heritage Room for a brief tour or just to visit. We'll be open until 5 p.m. today. So the Heritage Room is funded by an endowment, which is supported by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, and that was established through the Foundation for Lincoln City Libraries. The NLHA continues to support the Heritage Room through membership, programming, and fundraising efforts, and I want to thank them for making events like this possible. The mission of the Heritage Room is to preserve and promote literature by and about Nebraska authors. So one way we can do that is by providing the John H. Ames reading series for authors to share their books, which enables our community of readers to learn about the great literary talent in our state. This is the 219th event since our first program in 1985. And today we're really pleased to host Jeff Korbelik, who's the author of The Lost Restaurants of Lincoln. Jeff has written about restaurants for more than 20 years at the Lincoln Journal-Star. Previously, he spent 10 years as a sports journalist before switching gears in 1998. And he joined the Journal-Star's feature staff as an entertainment reporter. He covered dining, performing arts, television, and radio. He served as the newspaper's feature editor from 2012 to 2018, before becoming the winery manager at James Arthur Vineyards in Raymond. Jeff grew up in Beatrice and Lincoln. He graduated from Lincoln Southeast High and the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So everyone please welcome Jeff Korbelik.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks for coming out today. I'm a little taller than she is. So we'll kind of jump right into this. I got a little slideshow that we'll be going through, so you'll see some photos that appear in the book, and if you have any questions, just throw them out as we go along. I love questions. I'm in the business where I ask a lot of questions, so to have people ask me questions is kind of fun for a change. As Diane mentioned, I worked at the Lincoln Journal-Star from 1996, and I'm actually still writing the restaurant reviews. I'm the restaurant review guy, so it's been a fun job. A lot of people ask, well, what makes you qualified to write restaurant reviews? And I said, well, I like to eat. But part of it is I tell folks that all of us are critics, whether you're watching a television show or a movie or going out to eat. You have an opinion about what they serve you or what you just saw on the screen, and so we're all critics at heart. Just for 20 plus years, I got paid to do it, so I got to put my words on paper. When we started Ground Zero in 1998, we had divided it up into sections. So we had movies and performing arts, which was theater and dance and classical music, and dining and pop music, what was happening at the bars and that kind of thing. I kind of fell into being the dining critic. We were supposed to divide that up among the staff. There was 4 of us, and we were going to share the dining reviews. But my editor at the time, she would every week. I did the first one, which was Cracker Barrel. My very first dining review was Cracker Barrel. It's still going strong. So then the second week, she says, well, Jeff, where are you eating at this week? And I was like, I didn't know I was supposed to eat it. And I thought somebody else was in it. She says, no, you'll do it. And then the third week, she goes, Jeff, where are you eating at this week? So that's how I became the dining critic. So, and about 10 years into it, we started out, we were just writing feature stories about the restaurants. And then I decided we needed a little more criticism to it. Our readers wanted, something a little more, in depth or critical about the places we went to. beyond, they still wanted to know who was running the restaurant and that kind of thing, but then they also wanted that. So I sat down with a couple of chefs, and one of them is in the book, Maggie Pleshik, who owned Maggie's Vegetarian Wraps. And I sat down with Maggie and Sean Carmichael, who owns Shea Hay Catering in town and has a little restaurant where Dugan's Pub used to be. It's called Shea Zoda now. I sat down with the two of them and said, okay, I want to do this, and to try to add some critique. And so we came up with a plan. And so now if you read my reviews now, there is a little bit of criticism. It's divided into service and food quality and atmosphere and specialty diets, which is a big thing for restaurants now. And I grade them on it. And then it's a positive critique. I don't want to go out of my way to destroy a restaurant, because these are a lot of them are owned by mom and pops, and they put their hard-earned money, and it's not my place to say place is horrible, and if the place is horrible, it won't last long. So what I call it constructive criticism, and that's what I tried to do with my articles. So I'd been doing this, and Arcadia Publishing, they have a branch of it called History Press. They reached out to me, and they said, they sent me an email, and they said, do you know anybody who could write a book about old restaurants? Arcadia Publishing is in South Carolina, and they specialize in memory books. So they do this in places all over the country. And it's not just restaurants. I just saw another one come out in Denver, and they featured all the old department stores in Denver. So somebody wrote a book about that. They also do I seen one for travel, Nebraska travel. So where the landmarks like Chimney Rock and those kinds of things. So they sent a book, and they asked me. They said, do you know anybody who could write a book? And I said, well, me. Possibly, yeah. I said, but I'm extremely busy, so I gave them a couple of names, and they immediately wrote back, and they said, well, yeah, we're familiar with a couple of these names, but we'd really like you to do it because you have, the background in the restaurant industry. And I said, well, let me get back to you. And they kept coming to me, and I said, let me get back to you. And after about 2 months, and my wife, who's here, she's sitting over there, so she encouraged me to do it, and then Jim McKee, who's our local historian, he sat me down and said, Jeff, everybody has one book in them. So, and he said, Jeff, this is your book. So at the urging of Jim and my wife Rebecca, I decided to go ahead and do it, and then I said, and I thought, well, that'd be great. I can spend a couple of years on my off hours to do this, and they said, no, we need this in 6 months. So I said, okay. So being a newspaper guy, that's I'm used to deadlines. So I had to put this together fairly quickly. So the question I get asked the most about it is, why didn't you include this restaurant or this restaurant or this restaurant? The biggest reason is time. I didn't have time to get to it. I could have made this book even longer than it is. But like I said, I had six months to do it, and that included research and interviews. And then transcribing those interviews, and any of you who've written a book, you know all this, and then actually sitting down and writing, and then rewriting, and then rewriting some more. Yes, so sending it off. I had a very good friend who's an English professor at Union College, and she helped, and so she did some of my editing for me, and I'd go back and make some corrections and things like that. So that was part of it. Writing the book. Then you had to figure out how to break it down and how to decide which ones are in it. I had 32 restaurants that I wrote about in the book. And then I broke it down as I was starting to look through. I saw this pattern develop, and on one end it was restaurants and supper clubs that were fairly popular here in Lincoln, and then on the other end it was drive-ins and cafes. Those kinds of things. So they seem like two separate entities. So I divided it into two parts, and then a chapter for each restaurant in each part. I started by going to city directories first. I just went back and started with 1900 and went in the section and looked at restaurants. Interestingly, in the early 1900s, there weren't very many restaurants in Lincoln, Nebraska. It's probably, the population wasn't that big anyway. But back then, it was boarding houses. People ate where they stayed. And that's, so there weren't, they didn't go out to eat, they just ate where they were staying. It was about the late 1920s, pretty much after World War I in 1930s, when you started seeing the restaurants really pop up in Lincoln. And in fact, the first slide, one of the first ones, was the Acme Chili Parlor.
Can we turn those lights off?
Yeah, can we turn these lights off? Yeah. So we got the Acme Chili Parlor. It was downtown. It was operated by a Greek family, the Christopoulos family. He is believed to be the first Greek immigrant to Lincoln, Nebraska. I find that interesting. One of the things about that's the strength of Lincoln's dining scene is its ethnic restaurants. People often ask me, what is Lincoln known for in terms of, restaurants? And number one is the ethnic restaurants. If you go to Lincoln, there's a strong Thai, Chinese, Mexican, Korean, African. And I think part of the reason is because the university is here and the kids are here. And so they, oftentimes want, a home away from home, a place to eat. So to have one of the first restaurants in Lincoln, popular restaurants by a Greek immigrant, just kind of makes me feel good to see that. They're also known for that. Their chili was very, very spicy, very spicy. In fact, if you read the book, there's even a chapter about the chili and about where the recipe came from. So it's pretty interesting. The Acme Chili Grill was opened in the 30s, and it lasted until the early 60s, so it was around 30 plus years. That was one of the criteria for the restaurants that I had in here was how long were they around. They had to have some longevity to them. So, there's some obvious ones that, when you write about Lincoln restaurants, you have to have Tony and Luigi's in there, of course. You have to have the Legion Club, because that was, a landmark here, especially during Nebraska football heydays in the 1970s, because Coach Bob Devaney hung out there. So those were, Tasties In and Out. You had to have Tasties. It was around for 50 plus years. You have to have Tasties. The Steakhouse, it was around for 50 plus years. So yeah, some of these. So those were the obvious ones. And here we go, the Legion Club. This is Bob Logsdon, the longtime general manager, and he also served as pallbearer at Coach Devaney's funeral. And the Legion Club it fit into the supper club. If you people remember, it was on O Street. Well, it actually started downtown, then it moved over to O Street. Yeah, it moved over to O Street, and then they grew. They grew the place because it became so popular, and they added like levels to it, and it was known. After World War II, the veterans, they came back and they wanted, stuff to do, entertainment-wise, and that included dining. So they would dine, and then after they were done eating, they would stay and they would dance. And so the Legion Club was a very popular dance club, and they would draw some of the top music in the Midwest, which included like Jay McShann, the famous jazz pianist, who would come up here from Kansas City regularly to play. And so that was part of it. And then, of course, the Legion goes hand in hand with Nebraska football. And I interviewed Bob's son, Rob, and he would tell me stories about it and about how popular the place was, and about Coach Devaney's presence. And then even after that, Coach Osborne. Bob Devaney, after a football game, he and assistants would eat there, and they were very approachable. You could just go up and talk to him, and say, "Good game, Coach," and he would talk right back. So if you knew Coach Devaney, Lita does. He was a common guy. He just got along with everybody. So so the Legion Club was a big part of that. This is Arturos. It opened as the Taco Hut. This was Lincoln's very first Mexican restaurant. I sat down with the Longoria, the grandkids of the people that opened this. I sat down with Rennie and Daniel, and they own a martial arts studio here in town now. And they told me a story about how their grandmother, when they opened the taco hut, that nobody knew what what Mexican food was then. We think it's commonplace now, but back then in the '60s, it wasn't so much. And she, in order to get people to come in and eat the Mexican food, she had to sort of trick them. So the downtown workers, the street workers and stuff would be out, and she'd say, "Hey, come on in. I'll serve you some pie." So she'd serve them some pie, and then once she got them pie, then she would come out of the kitchen with Mexican food. She'd go like, "Here, try this. What do you think of this?" And then people were like, "Well, that's pretty good," So said, "Well, when you come back, order this," So that was how she introduced folks to Mexican food. The Taco Hut then moved just down the block, renamed itself Arturos.
Where was that?
That is on the infamous Block 35. So I say Block 35 because it's where Embassy Suites is now, and it's in downtown Lincoln. The city moved all those businesses out of there in order to develop it, and if you remember, it sat as a parking lot forever. But there were some dirt cheap. The record store was there. Arturos was there. There was a bar I went to called McGuffey's that was there. So the Skylight Bistro, which is in the book, was on Block 35. So we had all these famous, and so they shut it down. And and when I moved back, it was still a parking lot because it was. Yeah, it's a 10th and P. So it was right across the street from the Journal-Star. So Arturos were there. They operated, and then they ended up moving. They had a restaurant on 70th and Van Dorn, and then they eventually came back downtown, and then they finally decided to close. The kids really didn't want to run it, so they closed. But they were famous for tachas, Tachas. It was the recipe is in the book. That was one of the things when I wrote this book. I added recipes because some people remember some of the foods that they ate there, and Daniel and Rennie provided me the recipe for the tachas. It's basically a flat tortilla with refried beans and either pork or cheese or a combination of both, and some jalapenos thrown on top. And I love those things. Some of you folks may have memories of that, but yeah. All right, this is a poster from the Drumstick. The Drumstick was a chicken restaurant on North 48th Street. It's where McDonald's is now on North 48th Street. The story behind the poster is for Charlie Burton, who's probably one of the most famous rock guys from Lincoln, Nebraska, and his band playing there. The Drumstick opened. It was a chicken restaurant, and then it became a 24-hour chicken restaurant. So it was one of the first 24-hour restaurants in Lincoln. And I sat down with Diane Can, who went on to run the High Nooners, the sandwich shop downtown. And her father opened the Drumstick. And so I sat down with Diane and her brother, and we talked about the early years. And and it was a very successful as a chicken restaurant. It was extremely successful when it went 24 hours because the bars would close and people were hungry and they wanted somewhere to eat. So they did more business between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. than they did the rest of the day. So when Diane's mom passed away, her dad decided to take a step back, and then one of her other brothers, who recently passed away too, but her other brother came back from Maine. He was living in Maine, and he was kind of a wild guy and loved his music. And he said, why don't we, start booking some bands? And so they started bringing in some bands, and in fact, Charlie Burton was one of the first ones to play, and it really took off. There wasn't a lot of live music in Lincoln at the time, and the Zoo Bar, had a place, and then some other places were doing cover bands, but original live music there wasn't a lot. And this place took off, and so you may have heard like Joan Jett and the Blackhearts played at the Drumstick. REM played at the Drumstick. The Red Hot Chili Peppers played the drum. So all these bands who later became famous would come into town and play at the Drumstick. The funny story is when musicians think Drumstick, they think this. That's not what the Drumstick was. It was a chicken restaurant. It was there for the chickens. So when I wrote the chapter, I lead a story. L. Kent Wogamon, a very good friend of mine and my coworker, had interviewed one of the band members from REM, and they came into town and the first time they walked into the Drumstick, they saw these two families eating chicken, and they were like, "Where in the hell are we?" Yeah. So they didn't realize it that it was. So it made for a good thing. All right, this is Kay's Restaurant. Kay's was in Piedmont at 48th Street, 48th and Cotner, right around there, 48th A and Cotner, where all those meet. And that's Kay to the right. She's sitting there with James Brooks, director James Brooks, who directed the Academy Award-winning film Terms of Endearment. They filmed the movie here in Lincoln, and they filmed a bunch of the scenes in Kay's Restaurant. And so that's how that chapter, I mean, how often does a Academy Award Best Picture get filmed in Lincoln, Nebraska? Well, once. And Kay's was a very big part of that. And Kay's Restaurant was unique. She got her start working at a pancake shop, Scott's Pancake Shop, which may trigger some memories for you. And then she opened up her own place. She was one of the first women business owners at the time. She was very proud of that. And her restaurant was very successful. You can see that lion over her left shoulder on the wall, the picture of the lion. If you remember Kay's, one of the rooms was, she was a nut about lions. So her menus had lions on it. And then when people found out that she loved lions, they started bringing her lions. So that whole room, there was lions all over the place. So yeah, it had a motif. And that's in the chapter. Well, she was one of the first that started introducing heart-healthy foods. And one of her best customers was Coach Osborne, because he had had a heart attack, if you remember, in the early 80s. And so she started with a heart healthy.
Why did that close? I thought it was very successful.
Oh yeah, she was retired. She was retiring. All her kids worked for her. In fact, her daughter was general manager, and her son was worked in the kitchen and stuff. But the kids really didn't want to do it anymore. And then Kay's husband fell into bad health, and so they retired and moved to Florida. Yeah, and so that's where I interviewed Kay by phone. I reached her down in Florida, and then her husband recently passed away. And when I did a book signing at 4 Star Drug, her daughter Beth called me and wanted to make sure that everything was going okay. I said yeah, and I said okay. And so they came on, and there was Kay. She was standing right in front of me with Beth. And I was like, what? She was like, yeah, I moved back after her husband passed away, so she's back here in town. But I was so pleased to see her, and I gave her a big hug, and because she was very helpful on that. But yeah, she told some great stories about Governor Carey and Deborah Winger. They had their own room, by the way, at Kay's Restaurant. So. All right, this is Ken Eddy's. As I mentioned, I divided this up into restaurants, supper clubs, and then the other part was diners, drive-ins, and cafes. And so this was Ken Eddy's. It was on 48th Street. It was, a very popular restaurant. As you can see, look at those old cars. That's, it looks like it's from the 50s. Ken Eddy's eventually evolved into Eddy's Restaurant. It became a nice sit-down restaurant, and it lasted to the 80s. The owner, Eddie Gold, passed away, and then turned it over. His wife, Lou Gold, then ran it for a number of years, and then she ran it all the way up until the early 80s, and then she sold the land to be developed. And but it was, like I said, the drive-ins were kind of a novelty. As I mentioned, one of the drive-ins that you had to have if you're writing about Lincoln restaurants is King's. And here we are, King's. I had to have this picture because if you look on the tables, if you remember when you ate at King's, you called it in. They had telephones, so you can see the telephones in the booths. When I was a kid, my sister Jamie and I, that was a big treat for us because my mom would let us call in the kitchen. We'd get to call the orders in. So it was a great deal. King's was probably one of the first successful franchises. You know, you think about local franchises like Runza, Amigos, Taco Inn. These are all had their start here in Lincoln, Valentino's, and then they have expanded throughout the state. The very really first successful one was King's. If you remember, they were all over town, all over the place. So they were known for their hamburgers. They were known for their cheese Frenchies. My dad loved those cheese Frenchies. He still loves cheese Frenchies. So, and then they were known for these darn phones in the booths. This is Kurt and Pearl Cool. They're friends of the family. I've known them forever. Kurt passed away probably about 10 or so years ago, but Pearl just celebrated her 90th birthday. Cool's Restaurant was a fixture in downtown Lincoln. It's a block from the Journal-Star. It was on 10th and O Street. Kurt and Pearl started the restaurant, believe it or not, at 17th and Van Dorn, and this is the picture you see them standing there. That restaurant now is Normandy, the French restaurant here in town. So they were a neighborhood restaurant when they started out. They were a steakhouse. They eventually moved over to Rathbone Village, where their restaurant is now. Stir 22 is over there now. So they were there, and then they came downtown, and they were operating a couple of cafes out where the YMCA is now. It used to be a hotel, so they operated a restaurant there, and then where the Graduate is now. There was a hotel many hotels ago there too that they operated there when they decided to again open their own place on 10th and O. And it was probably one of the best breakfast places in town, especially in downtown Lincoln. It was very hard to find breakfast food in downtown Lincoln. It still is hard to find breakfast food in downtown Lincoln. And so they ran it for a number of years, and then they turned it over to a Greek family, the Kamatis family, who then ran it for another several years, and they were very successful. And Pete and Stella, they were great people. They're related to Papa John Kazis. Papa John's is in the book, and his sons own the Parthenon here in town. So there's this connection. Everybody in the restaurant industry in this town seems to know each other. So. This is Maggie. I mentioned Maggie at the top. When I wrote this book, I wanted some old restaurants like the Acme Chili Grill and the Yum Yum Hut, folk, so that to hit that end of the spectrum. But then I wanted some more contemporary restaurants that had some longevity to it, that aren't around anymore, that people that would some of the younger folks may identify with and go, oh yeah, I know that. So Maggie probably ran the city's most successful vegetarian restaurant. She ran it for 18 years, and before she decided to move on to other things. And for somebody to run a vegetarian restaurant in Lincoln, Nebraska, in a beef state successfully, that's something, especially for 18 years. And she did a wonderful job at it. This is Arnie Peterson. Arnie Peterson is baking Miller and Payne cinnamon rolls there. That is what he's doing. I included Arnie in the story when Arnie retired, and then he started making cinnamon rolls for his friends and family out of his house, and I wrote a story about that for the Journal-Star. And he continued baking those famous cinnamon rolls. He couldn't eat them. He was diabetic. He could not eat any of the cinnamon rolls that he baked, but he loved making them. And here he is in the Miller and Payne kitchen. This is another restaurant that you have to have on the Lincoln restaurant list if you're writing a history book. Miller and Payne was, has quite a history in this town, not only as a department store but also as a cafe. And so a lot of people have memories of the cinnamon rolls. You can still get the cinnamon rolls. The family shared the recipe with the Runza folks, so you can get it through them. They also had their macaroni and cheese, and their chicken pot pies. Yeah, so. You know what? I had the chicken pot pie recipe, and I almost included it. A lot of my recipes I got back in the '80s. The Lincoln Star used to run a thing called Chef's Corner, And they would share recipes. Readers would write in. I'd like to, so they would go around to various restaurants and share some of these recipes. So I got a ton of the recipes there, and I had the chicken pot pie recipe, but I just didn't feel good about sharing that because the family, the Campbell family, had shared that with Runza, and I didn't know if Runza had that recipe or not, and I really didn't want to get in trouble. So I left that one out. I checked with my publisher, and they were like, okay, and I was like, I just don't want to risk that. There's the mug. Yeah, somebody recognizes that. It was about 33rd and O Streets. Look how, think of 33rd and O today and look at what 33rd and O used to look like back in the 30s. I mean, that's the country. So, most of Lincoln was, downtown. Yeah, and what I like about this photo is the mug looked like an actual mug with a face on it. So you can see the eyes are up at the top. The order counter was the mouth. And when they closed that counter, they would close that counter at night, and it was painted white, so it looked like teeth. So this was one of the popular drive-ins back in the 30s. 50s even. So it's in the book. I don't have my notes here. This is Norma from Norma's Place and her husband. The other thing I wanted to do with this book was, not to be, downtown centric or anything like that. I wanted to spread it throughout the city. Norma ran a very successful diner in Havelock. Norma's Place was there for almost 30 years. And then after Norma retired, she turned it over to her son Leroy, and then Leroy and his wife ran it for a number of years before they sold the business. And she ran it. It was very popular. It was well known for its biscuits and gravy. So yeah, and they would do lunch specials. When Burger King opened near them, the Burger King is still over there. They had to figure out a way to, because they were starting to lose their lunch crowd. So they had to figure out a way to get that. So they did a daily special, and they promised that they would get you in and out of their restaurant in less than an hour. So that was their claim to fame.
Jeff, were they next door to the
Yes,
theater?
right down. Yes, well, they were right across the street from the theater, next door to Misty's. So yeah, just down the street from Misty's. So.
Right near Arnold.
Yeah, right near Arnold's. Okay, this is P.O. Pears. As I mentioned, this is one of the contemporary restaurants, and these are the lips that you would go in and order your hamburgers from. P.O. Pears were known that when they built this place, the owner had a connection with a warehouse of Hollywood memorabilia in Los Angeles, and so they had a bunch of stuff from movie sets that was in the restaurant. So the lips weren't one of them. The lips were just a novelty thing that the guy picked up. But everybody remembers those lips, and so you would go and order your food there, and then you had to go to the bar to order your beverages, and then you go and pick up your food at the lips. Later on, P.O. Pears became famous for their Burger Madness, where you could get discounted hamburgers on Sundays. It was very popular with college kids like me back in the 80s. So I ate a lot of burgers on Sunday afternoons at P.O. Pears. P.O. Pears was about 9th and M Streets, In fact, it's kind of still there. It's just nobody's operating out of it right now. There we go. Somebody knows her. There we go. I wanted to include Herb in the book. I did a chapter on the Rotisserie. The Rotisserie was started by an Iranian immigrant, Bob Sepapor. His son Nader runs several restaurants in town right now. Nader runs, he owns the Mars Bar, he owns Amo Manu, he owns Yaya's Pizza, and so I sat down with Nader, we talked, and he was like, well, Jeff, you're going to have to mention Herb. And I said, of course I'm going to mention Herb in the chapter about the rotisserie. Herb, Ground Zero proclaimed Herb the best waiter in Lincoln, and I wrote a story about it. If you ever dined at the rotisserie or the Lincoln Exchange before that, you wanted to have Herb. You wanted to have Herb as your waiter. He was a server extraordinaire. And it didn't matter if you were a bus driver or if you were the mayor. He treated you the same, and you rewarded him for that. He did a great job. And Herb then went on to San Francisco to work at a bunch of restaurants there before he sadly passed away at too early of an age. But herb and the rotisserie kind of go hand in hand. So that if you on the chapter about that, you'll read about Bob Sepaport. The interesting thing about the rotisserie was they were kind of ahead of their time. Nader told me when they opened it, it's on the corner of 11th. It's a dish restaurant now. It's on the corner of 11th. If you know, there's a big plate glass windows there that you can look in. Well, back in the day, restaurants, you know, people didn't want to be seen eating, so restaurant, you know, you went in and that kind of thing. So they opened it up, and Nader said they eventually had to put curtains in the windows because people didn't want to be seen eating. But now you look at every restaurant has these great big windows and high ceilings and hard floors, and it's super loud. Yeah, that's just one of my complaints about restaurants. But but back then they had an open kitchen, which was kind of a novelty. Not a lot of restaurants did. So they had an open kitchen where you'd go in, you could actually see the chefs behind there, and they all wore bicycling hats because most of them actually rode bicycles to work. So so they had that. So they had an open kitchen. They were the second restaurant to have outdoor seating. The first one was Pontillo's, I believe, so they introduced outdoor seating, and now every restaurant in town seems to have some kind of an outdoor area to eat. Oh, he also introduced rotisserie chicken, and it didn't take off. He had to finally go to steaks because nobody would eat rotisserie chicken. All right, here we go. This is Tasties. My friend Eric Gregory, who's a photographer at Journal Star, took this photo. What I love about this photo is it kind of shows you the drive-in, which is backwards. If you remember, if you go to Tasties, of course, when I was growing up, I always thought that was the way drive-ins were supposed to be. Because my dad did the driving, and then my mom was in the passenger seat, and she had the money. So so you drive in. If you remember, when you drive in, the window was on the passenger side, and so that's and it was that way until they ended up selling it 50-some years. After 50-some years, it was always on that. They were also they had vacuum tubes in there, so when you would do your order, they would stick it in and send it off in a tube back to the kitchen. Yeah, did they have the vacuum tubes in that though? So okay, yeah. And Tasty, for some reason, Nebraskans love their loose meat sandwiches. Tasties was known for loose meats. I don't know what it is. So, when I was doing my research, there's a restaurant book out that has recipes of some of the restaurants. And when I was looking at this, they had compiled, there was 10 recipes for the Tasties because they never shared the recipes like a secret, but everybody had their version of the recipe. All right, here we go. This is Tony Alesio from Tony and Luigi's. This was my favorite chapter to write in the whole book. I sat down with Tony's son, Mike Alesio, and Mike's cousin, Tony Massinio. The two of them own Valentino's now. And I went over to their offices up on 70th Street and sat down and put a tape recorder between the two of them. And all you have to do is have Tony and Mike, you just say, let's talk about food. You put it between, you ask two Italians to talk about food, oh my goodness. And they just went off. And I was trying to figure out how to write this chapter, and I decided I went back through my tape and started listening to the conversation, and I thought, well, that's the best way to do it, is to let them describe it. So when I wrote the chapter, it's basically them going back and forth talking. And what was funny about Mike and Tony is that they would finish each other's sentences. One would start bringing it up, and the other would finish the sentence, and their hands were like flying all over the place, and they were getting so excited talking about the popularity of Tony and Luigi's back in the day. They told me, they said, Jeff, they can't believe how many times that people keep asking us to bring Tony and Luigi's back. And I said, well, why don't you? And he says, nah, too much work. No, we're not going to do that. So, they told me the funny story, I added this in the book, was Mike Alesio. Mike came in and he came in looking for his dad. He had to give his dad a ride home, and he came in, and the maitre d' at the counter said, yeah, your dad's upstairs talking to Bob Taylor. And he said, oh, Bob Taylor, okay. He was thinking Bob Taylor, the weather guy. If you remember, Channel 1011 had a weather guy, Bob Taylor. So he's thinking, Bob's here, getting some lunch or something like that. So he goes up and he walks into the room, and it was Robert Taylor, the actor. Now, if you remember, Robert Taylor is from Nebraska, and he was very good friends with Tony Alesio, and so they were just chit-chatting away, and they had Mike pull up a chair, and Mike was just like couldn't speak because Robert Taylor, the actor, was sitting across from his dad, and they were talking like they were good buddies when they were. So that was one of my favorite stories. Tony and Luigi's, started out. It was kind of a rough part of town because, it was out in the country, which is now 52nd and O. So they talked about how there would be fights in the parking lot. The first day of business, they made $6, on their first day, which. But they kept, and then the Luigi part, that was a family member as well. He decided he didn't want to be in the restaurant business so much anymore, so then Tony kind of ran it himself. The reason Tony Luigi's was so successful was because of Tony. When Tony made a point of visiting just about every table when you dine there, and he made himself well known. He and what his son and what his nephew said was he had a great memory. He could remember people's names. And oftentimes people would come in, like on football Saturdays, they'd come in from Kearney or Grand Island and thing, and then these people would come in and he would remember their names. And, so they would come once or twice a year, and he was just so good about that. And that says a lot when you're in the restaurant industry. That's the people part of it. So I think, Tony wore a suit, he had the nice shoes, he had the slicked back hair. I mean, he was Italian, Actually, I think he was Sicilian. But yeah, but he looked the part, and he really enjoyed it. So. All right, there's the back cover and the front cover. So those are all my slides. There are many, many more photos in the book. At this point, this is the part where I like where if you have some questions, you can go ahead and fire away. Yeah.
You talked about Tony and Luigi's and the Val's Pizza. I thought Valentino started over there by Idlewild Drive, and the Valentinos that had the restaurant or the cafe, grocery store there.
Yeah, they had Val's was over. If you remember, the original restaurant was on 37th and Holdridge, or 35th and 35th and yeah, 35th and Holdridge. The families kind of are intermingled, So they came together. So like Tony Massinio's family members started Val's, where Mike Alesio's was Tony. So that's how that came about. All right, any more?
What was your favorite place to dine?
That's it, because half of these I would have loved to have eaten at Acme Chili Grill, and I never got a chance, or Lebsack's Tavern. I would have loved to. Yeah, I would have loved to eat at Lebsack's because I heard that the three brothers that ran that place were quite the characters. And
Their father led the cooking.
Yeah, and I heard their chili was pretty spicy as well. Yeah.
Sandwiches
Or primo. So yeah, so I would have loved that. Of these, I had to, the ones that I missed the most, but that's because I've only been eating on the dining scene since the 80s or so much. But Crane River, if you remember, I added that. I put that in the book partly because it was one of Lincoln's first brew. The first brew pub was Laszlo's. It opened, and then about 2 years after that, Crane River opened. What was novel about Crane River was it was two women ran it, and it was funny. They got a lot of press nationally about two women running a beer place, a place that made their own beer. But they didn't get that so much in Lincoln because they were pretty well known. They were university professors, and everybody knew that they made beer. They'd been making beer for years, and they were like, okay, that's no big deal. It's Linda and Christina making beer, and now they're going to open a restaurant. The thing about that was they didn't want to get into the restaurant business. They just wanted to sell their beer. They wanted to share their beer, but back then you couldn't have. You had to have a restaurant in order to sell your beer at it. That's the way the state law was worked out. So they ended up getting in the restaurant business, and then they brought in Wind Coop, which is a popular restaurant in Denver, a beer restaurant. So they had the chef from there come here. And so Crane River was pretty well known for their menu, too. It was very novel. They had Help me out, Rebecca. What did they have on the menu? They had pumpkin cakes. Yeah, the pumpkin corn cakes, which were popular. They had a veggie burrito where you couldn't find. This was before Maggie was here, so yeah, a veggie burrito. They had probably the bread pudding was one of the best they had. So.
I know King's restaurants were real popular with certain high schools and
Yeah.
locations. Do you know how many of those there were originally in
I think I had that in the book at one point. I want to, and this is just my memory, which is not so good anymore. 9 or 10, I think, at one point that they were, and they were all spread out. And it's like you identified to a certain King's. So
And,
Not only in the Lincoln, but elsewhere.
yeah, and as I said, that was one of the franchises that started taking
when it
off.
went to King's Crest, was that the same?
It was the same, yeah. It was yes, it was the same owner. It was, and what's interesting about King's, it was the same owner, but it was like employees of the original King's, and so they would open up. So, like Fred Valenta, who worked for King's, opened up Parkway Lanes, the diner in there. So Fred and Ruby opened there, and then they served the King's burger there. So Fred had a connection, and then Howard for Howard's Pantry. Do you remember Howard's? Yeah, Howard's Pantry. So he had a connection to the King's family. So it was yeah. So it kind of spread out, you know, So yeah, so a lot of people would get their starts, and then get the recipes and stuff, and so when King's went away, some of these people were reintroducing the King's burger back into the mainstream, and they had the permission of the family. The family was like, "Hey, okay, we want people to do it." Larry Price was an interesting fellow. He just and his history's in the book, but he started selling those burgers at the state fair back in the 30s or 40s or something like that, and in fact, that's the photo on the cover of the book. That's Larry Price there selling his burgers at the
Going.
Yep.
That's the old Bethany School.
That is correct. Yep. And in fact, I grew up in the Bethany area at 61st and Holdridge Street, so I was very familiar with the Kings over in that neck of the woods. So yeah.
Where did you get the pictures?
Oh yeah, good question. The pictures, some of them are from the family. Like the Messinios and Alesios provided me a lot of the photos for the Tony and Luigi's. The Cools photo you saw, that was from the families. I dug into the Journal Star archives. That's where I found the picture of the mug, So I was able to use that. The newspaper, however, charged me to use them. They did give me a heck of a deal. But being an employee there at the time, you would think that, but oh well, that's another story. But it's part of the reason I'm not in the newspaper business anymore. So, and then a bulk of them also from Jim McKee. Jim McKee has a very big restaurant file. So, yeah. What question in the back?
I have not looked at the book, and I have to now.
Okay.
Because of what you had mentioned. But in your book, did you mention the hobnob?
Yeah, no, I didn't, and that was again. I had them on my list when I started my list. The hobnobs on there, and
Restaurant,
Mhm.
and that the most best pie, they cut it in 4 pieces.
Right.
And a lot of people go there at noon to eat downtown. A lot of people didn't drink their beer and all this stuff, but they had the best supper at night. They had the best hash browns, the best meatloaf at noon, and they had the best cherry pie.
Right.
And there's cut pie that's 4 pieces. They were 80-inch, nothing. And that pie was so good. And had meatloaf.
Right.
And they had ham and they had hash browns made from scratch. So
Yeah, see.
Big taste every
See, I could by just looking at your face, you're drooling right now. So you're remembering. Yes, you're remembering. Now, and one of these, and you mentioned pie because one of the restaurants is, in fact, it's because I did an alphabetical order, Alice's restaurant. And at one point, Alice had 3 restaurants operating in town. They were in various parts, but people went to the one in College View. That's the one that people remember the most. And she had a baker. Her last name was Opp, who then ended up baking pies for some of the other restaurants around town. But Alice's was, yeah, it was primo. And in doing my research, and some of it I couldn't find, because I was on a deadline and I didn't have the time to really dig into it. So another one, for instance, was the East Hills Supper Club out on 70th Street, and I really wanted to do that. I do have a couple of supper clubs in here, including the Esquire Club, and in fact, I grew up. My mom would make this. I'm going to tell a story about you, Rebecca. We grew up eating this dip. If you remember, they served a beer dip. Yeah, at the Esquire Club, they served a beer dip, and then they had it served it with veggies and chips and that kind of thing. And they colored it pink. Yeah, it was a pink beer dip. And so my mom, when we were growing up, my mom got this recipe, and so we always had beer dip growing up. Well, one meal we were back home, and Rebecca and I were visiting my parents, and my mom served the beer dip, and Rebecca thought it was like some kind of a strawberry kind of tough thing. She took a bite, and she was like, "Ooh, my gosh, what is this?" And my mom was like, "Well, that's the beer dip," you know. And she's like, "Why is it pink?" I have no idea why it's pink. But they always just colored it pink. They would add red food coloring to it, and so and it's a horseradish dip. It's horseradish, beer, and garlic salt. Basically, is how it is. So, and in the book, I added my mom's recipe for that beer dip as kind of a tribute to my mom. So I found stuff about the Esquire because the Esquire came and went and came and went and came back. But on the East Hill Suppers, I just couldn't find any. We didn't do any stories back in the day because I would dig into our files at the Journal Star, so we had a lot of stuff. And then I did a bunch of research on newspapers.com, which you have to subscribe to, but they have all the old Lincoln Stars and the Lincoln Journals, and then when the papers merged, they have all of those papers. So if you type in the word, they would take you to like either an ad or a classified or an actual story. But I couldn't find a bunch of stuff, and I just didn't have the time to find more stuff about the East Hill Supper Club. So some of these, yeah. You mentioned that restaurant. That was on my list, the Hobnob. So.
Another restaurant is the Sailor Sisters on West Salt.
Yeah, see, that one didn't ring a bell.
That one, I think operates from 1960 to 1985. Now it is a card shop, but it's right next to the bridge.
Right.
Dead man's run there, and they were the same way too. These two ladies ran, the two sisters, and mentioned the daughters were in the business, and then they had also food too. And this is a local place. Has people, the working people went there to eat. And it was not for classy people.
Right.
People, basically. And they had the pies that way, and they had the best omelets and the best hamburger steak.
Right.
And it was really good. The
Oh.
price was reasonable, and it was plain and simple and delicious.
Now you mentioned a hamburger steak because another restaurant that I wanted to do, but I couldn't find a lot of information. And I wanted to do because it was, it was the first Chinese restaurant. But I mentioned Chinese because the Congress Inn. Do you remember the Congress Inn? That was out on West O Street. And it goes
Your mom ran it.
Yeah, yes. And so it was the first Chinese, but I couldn't find, other than the names, but there wasn't, I couldn't find if they were still around or if they'd moved or anything like that. But I bring that, my dad is retired state patrol. And so my dad ate a lot on the road, and he ate a lot of meals at the Congress Inn, and he loved the hamburger steak there. So he would have the hamburger steak. But my dad was actually, one of the first people in our family to eat Chinese food because, back again, I mentioned the story about the Mexican restaurant. Chinese food was the same way. A lot of people were not familiar with it. Today, it's commonplace.
How about Lone Oak?
Yes, Lone Oak was on the list too, and that I was going to bring that up because some of the others I was talking Lone Oak and Johnson's Cafe. I actually had the owner of Johnson's Cafe approach me at another speaking engagement. She says, "If you write book 2, here's my information." So that was very sweet of her. So like I said, I had my list started with 100 and some restaurants, and I pared it down to 32.
There was one in Emerald at the west side of town that was a bowling alley, a dance hall, and a restaurant.
Yeah.
It burned.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Can't remember.
Yeah, I don't
I
remember
hauled
that.
beer at that.
Did you?
Did the Yum Yum Hut make it?
Yep. Yum Yum Hut. You mentioned that because somebody had mentioned some sisters that had owned a restaurant. But yeah, there were 3 sisters that ran the Yum Yum Hut. So yeah, that's in there.
I kind of think it's a neighborhood thing. I know
Yeah.
if you lived in Northeast Lincoln, it was Tasties.
Yes.
My mom went to Lincoln High, and we always called them Yum Yums.
Yes.
She was-
Yes, and that's what I mentioned Lincoln's fascination with the loose meat sandwiches. But yeah, the Yum Yum Hut was very popular, and it was in business for 30-some years. It closed in the mid-'60s.
Now you call them sloppy joes.
Yeah, we call them sloppy joes. So. Yeah.
There was a restaurant on 13th and N that was run by women, and it was like a cafe, and it was in the 50s, and it had healthy foods only,
Yeah.
because I was in foods and nutrition, and
Oh, was it?
this
So-
restaurant was open, and it was in the bottom of the Sharp Building on the...
Chef restaurant,
What was it?
chef restaurant.
Chef restaurant.
I don't know.
George Kill, he'd been the head
No,
chef at
these
the
were
Cornish
women,
Church.
I think that.
Yeah, wait a minute. So.
And then 220
Oh, probably
was
after him.
a dessert place on 32.
Oh yeah, I'd heard about that. One of you mentioned 13. The one there was a restaurant downtown which is in the book, the Greenwich Cafe. Do you folks remember that? I included that one, and it was a good story. Millie Weiler ran that restaurant with her husband, but Millie was kind of the face of the place, and she was quite a character as well. But they were known for fish and chips. I mean, that was it. And in the book details the story behind it. It was a university professor that came up with a recipe for that, and it was in fact it was a very popular among the university crowd because it was just hop, skip, and a jump from campus. But yeah, so I found the Greenwich was popular. In fact, I'll just kind of run down the list of restaurants, so then you can. So on the restaurants and supper club side, I had Alice's, Crane River, Drumstick, the Esquire Club, Grandmother's, yeah, Jack's Shack, remember that over on 27th Street, Kay's Restaurant, the Knowles, the Legionnaire Club, Lincoln Exchange, then I did this was together, Lincoln Underground and Brittany's, P.O. Pears, Reuben's. Reuben's was, I included Reuben's because Reuben's basically was one of the first true chains to come in, because Reuben's was popular elsewhere, and it came in, if you remember, it was over by Gateway, and it opened up. And people have a lot of fond memories of Reuben's, but I included that because when you think of Lincoln dining scene, I mentioned that we're known for our ethnic restaurants, and the other 2 things that Lincoln's known for now is, and it's not necessarily a good thing, but chain restaurants. We have a lot of chain restaurants here, and we didn't have that back in the day, and now we do. Yeah, and then the other thing that Lincoln is known is sports bars, and that's obvious why we have a lot of sports bars here. Okay. I had the Rotisserie, Skylight Bistro, which was on that block 35 I told you about, the Steakhouse, Arturos, and Tony and Luigi's. And then under the cafes, diners and drive-ins, I had the Acme Chili Grill, Bishop's Buffet, remember that out at Gateway? It started downtown, then moved outside. Yeah, there was downtown. Greenwich Cafe, Ken Eddie's, which turned into Eddie's Restaurant, King's Food Host, Cool's Restaurant, which we talked about, Lebsack's Brothers Tavern, which we chatted about, Maggie's, which I showed you in that, Miller and Payne, The Mug, Norma's Place, which was in Havelock, Papa John's. I included Papa John's. It was around for about 13 years. Papa John Cazas actually opened. He came to Lincoln to open a Bonanza restaurant, and he had the Bonanza here, and then when he wanted to open his own place, but he had signed a contract with Bonanza, and he wasn't allowed to open any kind of restaurant with the same kinds of foods. And so he said, okay, I'll serve Greek food then. So yeah, because that's what his background, he was a Greek. So yeah, so he served Greek. And in fact, that was my introduction to Greek food, was eating at Papa John's downtown on 13th and O Street. And now today, then all his kids worked at the restaurant, and now George, his son, and Mike, both the sons, run the Parthenon over in 56 and Highway 2. Let's see what else. Papa John's Tasty In and Out, which we talked about, and the Yum Yum Hut. So yeah, those were the 32.
Would
Yeah.
the Knolls have been the first Greek, kind of like you're saying, the first Chinese, or the first, because
The
Solace's owned it, I mean, they served.
yeah, and in terms of like a buffet, yeah. I mean, I'd have to look to see when Bishop's opened, because you had those but the Knolls opened up, and what was unique about the Knolls was it was a country club, but it was open to the public, so you could go not only play golf there, but you could go and eat
Originally,
there as well.
On Cornister Highway in 56,
Yeah,
by the motel.
by the motel. Right. Yeah.
Just two thoughts. I never learned that uppity name. I thought it was the Greenwich.
No, the Greenwich. You know why it was called the Greenwich Cafe? Well, they named it after New York, Greenwich. Yeah. So.
Anyway, the other thing is you haven't mentioned the best hamburger steaks in town. Foster's Truck.
Oh yeah, you know what? And here, in fact, as I said, people were like, "Well, how can my dad?" Got after he read the book, he was like, "Why didn't you have Foster's in there?" Yeah, my own dad. Yeah, so yeah, he as I mentioned, he's retired state patrol. That was one of the places that he ate at a lot, because it was out like on 27th and Cornhusker. Yeah, and so he, of course, as a state patrol, they did a lot of time on Cornhusker Highway back in the day. So there's, again, it was time constraints. I do have another list, and then whether I get up enough gumption to. And Lita knows this. It takes a lot of work to write a book. So, yeah, and a lot of research and a lot of time. So, all right. Any more questions before Diane? I see her creeping up here.
I'm creeping.
Yes. People, thank you for coming out today. I really appreciate this. I had a lot of fun writing this book. The response to it has been, I guess, overwhelming. 4-Star Drug just put out an ad featuring it again, their little mailer. And they said it was their best-selling book in their history. And they didn't even tell me. I just saw that on there, and Rebecca showed that to me. I was like, "Ooh, cool." So I think people remember, like the gentleman back there. You remember the foods, and you remember experiences. And I've told people, I have a lot of people come up to me and they want to tell me about, that they went to Tony and Luigi's and that was where they got engaged, or that's where they had their first date. And I think food stirs those memories in us. And as I said, I can remember King's because my sister and I got to call on the telephone, so that's a memory for me. And I didn't actually eat at the Esquire Club, but the memory for me is my mom making that beer dip, so that it will always be with me. So I think that's why this book has resonated with a lot of folks. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Well, Jeff, thanks so much for coming today. This was a great talk, and it brought up all these memories for me of all these favorite restaurants. And I just wanted to give you a little token of our gratitude for you visiting today, doing the Ames reading series. Thank you.